The dust of Dodge City settled on everything. And that September afternoon in 1884, a fine red powder that coated the boardwalks clung to the brims of hats and found its way into the back of a man's throat. Inside the First Bank of Dodge, however, the air was cool and still smelling of oiled wood and old paper. Jedediah "Jed" Stone stood before the teller's cage, his broad shoulders filling the space, his face set in the stoic lines of a man who had learned long ago not to expect much from the world. "The box for Stone," he said, his voice a low rumble that barely disturbed the quiet. The clerk, a young man with a pristine collar and nervous hands, nodded quickly and disappeared into the vault. Jed waited, his gaze fixed on the polished mahogany counter, his thoughts a world away from the cattle prices and land deeds that usually brought men to this place. He was here for a memory, the only one he allowed himself to touch. The clerk returned, placing a small, heavy metal box on the counter. Jed produced a key from his waistcoat pocket, and the metal worn smooth from years of contact with his skin. The lock clicked open with a soft, final sound. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a silver locket tarnished at the edges, but still gleaming in the filtered sunlight from the tall windows. It was shaped like a heart, intricately engraved, with the image of a prairie rose. He didn't open it. He never did. He knew the faces inside by heart, a younger version of himself, smiling with an ease he no longer possessed. And Sarah, his first wife, her eyes bright, with a love that had been extinguished as brutally as a candle in a storm. He had come to retrieve it, to place it in the bottom of a trunk at the ranch, a final burial of a past that he had been forced to resurrect by marrying again. The thought of his new bride Amelia arriving on the evening train was a dull ache behind his ribs. His fingers had just closed around the cool metal when the bank's doors burst open, crashing against the walls. Sunlight and a cloud of red dust flooded the room, silhouetting 5 figures. They moved with the brutal efficiency of wolves, 2 fanning out to cover the customers, 2 herding the tellers away from their cages, and 1 the leader striding directly toward Jed. He was tall and dressed in a fine black coat that seemed out of place on the frontier. His face was handsome, almost poetic, but his eyes held a chilling intensity, a burning blue that seemed to see right through a man's soul. He moved with a theatrical grace, a silver-handled pistol appearing in his hand, as if by magic. "Well now," the man said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that carried easily through the suddenly silent bank. "Preston Pittman, or is it Jedediah Stone these days? A man of many names, but I'd recognize that grim face anywhere." Jed felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. No one had called him Preston Pittman in 6 years. He straightened slowly, his hand instinctively moving toward the Colt peacemaker holstered at his hip. The man's smile was a slash of white in his dark beard. Ah. Let's not be hasty. My associates are a bit jumpy, and I'd hate for this fine establishment to be redecorated in such a permanent fashion." Jed's hand froze. He looked past the leader to the other men. They were hard cases, their eyes cold and their guns steady. The customers were frozen in terror, a woman clutching her child, an old man staring with wide, vacant eyes. The leader stepped closer, his gaze dropping to the open deposit box on the counter. His smile widened. "There it is. I was hoping you'd make this easy for me." He reached past Jed, his fingers plucking the silver locket from its velvet bed. He held it up, letting it swing gently from its chain. The heart of the matter, so to speak. "That has no value to you," Jed said, his voice tight with a rage he fought to control. "Take the money. Leave that." "Oh, but you're wrong," the man replied, his tone conversational, almost gentle. "It has immense value. To me, it's a reminder, a promise. And to you, well, to you it's everything, isn't it? The last piece of a life you tried to bury." He tucked the locket into his coat pocket. Consider this a down payment. You have something else I want, Pitman, and I will have it. I don't know you, Jed growled. You don't remember me, I'm wounded. But you knew my sister, Sarah. The name hit Jed like a physical blow. The air rushed from his lungs. The sounds of the bank, the quiet sobbing of the woman, the nervous shuffling of the clerk's feet faded to a distant roar. All he could see were the man's burning blue eyes, filled with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. You see, the man said softly. Now you understand. This isn't a robbery. It's a reckoning. He turned his movements fluid and unhurried. Gentlemen, our business here is concluded. As quickly as they had arrived, they were gone, melting back into the dusty street. For a long moment, the bank remained frozen in a tableau of shock. Then the woman began to wail, and the clerk slumped against the wall, and the manager started shouting for the marshal. Jed didn't move. He stood staring at the empty velvet lining of the box, the space where the locket had been a cold, gaping void. The man's name was Silas Kane. He knew it as certainly as he knew his own. Sarah had spoken of her brother, a wild, passionate boy who had gone east to make his fortune. Years ago, a boy who had adored his older sister with a fierce, possessive love. The robbery hadn't been about money. It had been a message delivered with surgical cruelty. And it meant the carefully constructed walls Jed had built around his grief were about to be torn down, just as a new wife was set to arrive, a stranger who would demand a place inside them. The cold knot in his stomach turned to ice. Silas Kane had not just stolen a memory. He had declared war. Amelia stepped off the train and onto the bustling platform, her grip tight on the handle of her single-worn valise. The journey from St. Louis had been a long, rattling affair, and the Kansas wind immediately set to work tugging at the pins in her carefully coiled hair. Dodge City was louder, dustier, and more alive than she had imagined. Cowboys swaggered along the boardwalks, their spurs jingling, and the air was thick with the smells of horse leather and coal smoke. She scanned the crowd for the man she was to marry, a man she knew only from a single stern-looking photograph and 2 brief, practical letters. He had described himself as tall with dark hair and gray eyes. Several men fit the description, but none approached her. After 10 minutes, as the crowd thinned and the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the tracks, a man detached himself from the wall of the station. He moved with a weary deliberation, his broad shoulders slumped as if under a great weight. It was him, Jedediah Stone. Miss Foster, he asked, his voice low and devoid of warmth. Mr. Stone, she replied, offering a small, hopeful smile that was not returned. It is a pleasure to meet you in person. The pleasure is mine. He said the words, a rote courtesy. He took her valise, his calloused fingers brushing hers for a fleeting moment. The contact was impersonal, like shaking hands over a business deal. The judge is waiting. We can be married before sunset. The ceremony in Judge Harrison's dusty office was as brief and unceremonious as their introduction. A few mumbled words, the scratch of a pen on a certificate, and she was Mrs. Jedediah Stone. There were no flowers, no well wishes, only the judge's gruff pronouncement and a sense of profound, unnerving finality. The wagon ride to the ranch was conducted in a silence broken only by the creak of the wheels and the jingle of the harness. Amelia sat beside her new husband, acutely aware of the space between them, a chasm as wide and empty as the prairie stretching out on all sides. She tried to make conversation, asking about the land, the cattle, the town, but his answers were clipped monosyllabic things that withered in the vast quiet. It is very open, she remarked, looking out at the sea of sun-scorched buffalo grass rippling under a vast, unforgiving sky. "It is," he agreed. She fell silent, chastened. She had attributed his reserved nature in his letters to the practical circumstances of their union. Her late father's debts, his need for a wife to help run the homestead, it was a common enough arrangement. But this was more than reserved. It was a cold, impenetrable wall. She wondered if he was already regretting the bargain. The ranch house appeared suddenly, a small, sturdy silhouette against the deepening twilight. It was well built with a small barn and corral nearby, but it looked desperately lonely, a solitary outpost in an ocean of grass. A grizzled, bow-legged man emerged from the barn as they pulled up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Boss," he said, tipping his hat to Jed. "Ma'am." He nodded at Amelia, his eyes curious but kind. "Gus, this is my wife, Amelia," Jed said. "Amelia, this is Gus, my ranch hand." "Pleasure to make your acquaintance, ma'am," Gus said, his voice a friendly rasp. "Hope the journey wasn't too rough on you." "It was fine, thank you," Amelia managed, grateful for the first warm words she had heard all day. Jed carried her valise inside. The house was sparse but clean. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, dominated by a large stone fireplace. A sturdy table and chairs stood in the center, and shelves lined one wall holding dishes and supplies. "Your room is upstairs," Jed said, gesturing toward a steep, narrow staircase. "I'll bring up the water for you to wash." She climbed the stairs to the loft, which was a single large room tucked under the eaves. A narrow bed with a thin quilt was pushed against one wall, a small nightstand beside it. It was her bridal chamber. She sat on the edge of the bed, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She had steeled herself for the wedding night, prepared for a husband who might be rough or demanding a stranger's claim on her body. When Jed appeared in the doorway later, he had washed and changed into simple work clothes. He carried a fresh blanket and his jacket. Instead of approaching the bed, he walked to the far side of the room near the stone chimney that rose from the fireplace below. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice a whisper. He didn't look at her as he spread the blanket on the rough wooden floor. "Making my bed. You take the proper one." The words were a slap. A hot flush of confusion and humiliation burned in her cheeks. "But we are married now." "Yes, we are," he said, his voice flat. "And as your husband, it is my duty to provide you with shelter and safety. The bed is yours." He settled onto the blanket, using his rolled-up jacket as a pillow, his back to her. She stared at his rigid form and the silence in the room pressing in on her. This wasn't just grief for a first wife. The original agreement had mentioned he was a widower. This was something else, something active and hostile. Through the single window, the mournful calls of coyotes echoed across the vast emptiness, and Amelia felt a shiver of a cold that had nothing to do with the night air. She had not just married a stranger. She had married a man at war with himself, and she was trapped on the battlefield. The first week established a pattern of rigid, silent routine. Jed rose before dawn and was gone, leaving Amelia to wake alone in the cold loft. She would find him in the corral, his movements with the horses sharp and efficient, his face closed off. They ate their meals in a silence so profound she could hear the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. He would answer her direct questions, but never offered a word of his own, his gray eyes shadowed with a darkness she couldn't penetrate. Gus, the old ranch hand, was her only source of conversation. He was a font of earthy wisdom and frontier slang, his presence a small island of warmth in the cold sea of her new life. "Don't you mind the boss none, ma'am," he told her one morning as she fed the chickens. "He ain't been right since, well, for a long while. But that business in town last week that rattled him, something fierce." "Business in town?" Amelia asked, scattering the last of the grain. Gus spat a stream of tobacco juice. Heard tell there was a holdup at the bank. Fella went right for the boss, took something of his. Something personal. Jed ain't said a word about it, but a man don't get that look in his eye from a stray calf. The pieces clicked into place. The tension, the distance, it wasn't just about her. He was afraid. He was threatened. And he was shutting her out to protect her, or perhaps to protect himself. The realization didn't make her feel better. It made her feel more helpless. The threat did not remain distant for long. 2 weeks after her arrival, Gus found one of the wells poisoned, the water fouled with lye. A dead calf lay beside it, a clear and vicious warning. Jed's face was grim as he surveyed the damage, his jaw tight. That night, a rider galloped past the house in the dead of night, firing a single shot that shattered the kitchen window. Amelia cried out, and Jed was on his feet in an instant, rifle in hand, but the rider was already gone. His mocking laughter swallowed by the darkness. The next morning, an envelope was pinned to the barn door. Inside, a crudely drawn picture of a tombstone with the name Stone on it, and a simple message: "The land, or your life. You have 1 month." Jed stared at the note, his knuckles white as he crumpled it in his fist. "We have to go to the marshal," Amelia insisted, her voice trembling. "The law in Dodge is whatever Sheriff Brody says it is," Jed said, his voice flat. "And Brody is a man who can be bought." "Then what will we do?" "I will handle it." He said the words a dismissal. He turned and walked away, shutting a door between them as surely as if it were made of oak and iron. The attacks grew bolder. A dozen head of cattle were rustled from the north pasture. A small haystack near the barn was set ablaze, the fire extinguished just in time by Jed and a frantic Gus. Each incident was a turn of the screw designed to break Jed's spirit, to drive him off the land that was his only anchor. Through it all, he remained a fortress of silence, his fear manifesting as a cold, dangerous anger that he kept tightly leashed. He patrolled the ranch perimeter at night, rifle in hand, his face a mask of exhaustion and grim resolve. Amelia refused to be a passive victim. She learned to use the small rifle Jed kept by the door, practicing on tin cans Gus set up on a fence post, until she could reliably hit her target. She took over more of the ranch chores, freeing Gus to help Jed with patrols and repairs. She was determined to show her husband that she was not a liability, but a partner. One evening, Jed stumbled in from a patrol, his left arm bleeding freely from a deep gash. A bullet had grazed him during a skirmish with rustlers he'd surprised near the creek bed. "It's nothing," he grunted, trying to push past her. "Sit down," Amelia commanded, her voice firm. She ignored his protests, pushing him into a chair at the kitchen table. She fetched the medical kit, her hands surprisingly steady as she cleaned and stitched the wound. Her touch was gentle but efficient, her focus absolute. He sat rigidly, hissing in pain as the needle pierced his skin, but he didn't pull away. For the first time, he was forced to accept her help, to allow her inside his carefully guarded space. The lamplight cast a warm glow on her bent head, her brow furrowed in concentration. He watched her hands, capable and sure, and felt a crack appear in the icy wall around his heart. "Why did you marry me, Jedediah?" she asked softly, not looking up from her work. "You knew there was trouble? You could have sent me back." He was silent for a long moment, and the only sound the whisper of the thread through his skin. "Because I was tired of being alone," he said finally, the admission raw and quiet. "And because I am too stubborn to let a man like Silas Kane dictate how I live my life." He had spoken the name. Kane. It hung in the air between them, a confirmation of the faceless evil that haunted their lives. "Who is he?" she asked, tying off the final stitch. "He is a ghost," Jed said, his voice heavy. "A ghost I thought was long buried." He would say no more, but it was a start. As she bandaged his arm, their eyes met over the table. And in his gaze she saw not just pain and anger, but a flicker of something else, a grudging respect. They were not yet husband and wife, but in that moment they had become allies. The fragile alliance forged over Jed's injury began to grow in the weeks that followed. The silence between them became less a weapon and more a shared space filled with the unspoken understanding of their mutual danger. He started talking to her about the ranch, explaining the complexities of water rights and grazing patterns. In return, she read to him in the evenings from the books she had brought her voice, a calming presence against the ever-present threat that lurked outside their windows. Amelia, however, knew that understanding the ranch was not enough. She needed to understand the man. She needed to understand Sarah. One afternoon, while Jed and Gus were out mending a fence on the far side of the property, she climbed to the loft and found the old wooden trunk tucked under the eaves. It was not locked. With a sense of trespassing on sacred ground, she lifted the heavy lid. The scent of dried lavender and old memories rose to meet her. Inside were a woman's belongings, a pressed wedding dress, a small collection of poetry, a pair of delicate riding gloves. At the bottom, she found a small leather-bound album. She sat on the floor, the album open in her lap. The photographs showed a young, vibrant woman with a bright, infectious smile. Sarah. In many of the pictures, she was with Jed, a younger, happier Jed, his arms slung possessively around her shoulders. But one photograph caught her eye. It was a group picture from a town picnic. Sarah stood in the center laughing, and in the background, leaning against a tree, was a young man with a handsome, brooding face and burning eyes that Amelia recognized instantly. It was Silas Kane. He was staring at his sister with an expression of intense, almost unnerving adoration. Beneath the album was a small bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. They were from Sarah to a cousin. Amelia's hands trembled as she untied the ribbon. She knew she shouldn't, but she had to understand. She unfolded the first letter. My dearest Clara. It read, Preston is the kindest of men, but sometimes I fear he does not understand the fire in my own family's blood. My brother Silas writes from the East. He is furious that I have married without his approval, as if I were his property to bestow. He has always been so protective ever since Papa died. He sees any man who looks at me as a threat. I love him dearly, but his love is a cage, and I fear what he might do if he ever felt I were truly wronged. A cold dread washed over Amelia. This wasn't just a vendetta over land. It was older, deeper, twisted with a possessive love that had curdled into hate. Silas Kane didn't just blame Jed for Sarah's death. He blamed Jed for ever having her in the first place. That evening, the first blizzard of winter struck. The wind came screaming down from the north, a physical force that rattled the house to its foundations. Snow began to fall thick and fast, erasing the world outside their windows. They were trapped. The enforced intimacy of the storm broke down the last of Jed's reserves. As the wind howled like a legion of grieving ghosts, he finally told her everything. He sat by the fire, his face illuminated by the flickering flames, looking older and more broken than she had ever seen him. Her name was Sarah. He began, his voice rough with unshed tears. He told her of their courtship and their brief happy marriage, and the terrible agonizing birth of their son. The labor went on for 2 days. She was so small. And the baby? The baby was large. She fought so hard. His voice broke. She died within minutes of the birth. The baby, our son, lived only long enough for me to hold him once. As she was dying, she told me she loved me. She thanked me for making her a mother. He buried his face in his hands. I killed her, Amelia. My desire, my seed. It grew into the thing that destroyed her. I swore on her grave I would never put another woman at such risk. That's why I couldn't. I couldn't be a husband to you. I was trying to keep you safe. You didn't kill her, Amelia said softly, moving to kneel beside him. It was a tragedy, not a crime. Cain doesn't see it that way, Jed said, his voice muffled. He thinks I worked her to death, that I was too rough with her, that my lust killed his sainted sister. He warned me before he went east. He told me if I ever hurt her, he'd come back and take everything from me. I thought it was just a boy's empty threat. Amelia's mind raced, connecting the letters, the photograph, the story. Jed, the doctor who delivered the baby. What happened to him? Jed looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and confused. Dr. Albright. He was a good man. Kind. He did everything he could. He left town a few months after. Under a cloud, folks said. Some trouble with gambling debts. I never saw him again. A new terrible suspicion began to form in Amelia's mind. What if the doctor hadn't left because of debts? What if he had been run off, silenced by a man determined to preserve his own narrative of blame, a man who needed a villain to justify his rage? We have to find out what really happened, Jed, she said. Her voice filled with a new urgency. The truth is the only weapon we have against him. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, he saw not the woman he had a duty to protect, but the partner he desperately needed. The storm raged outside, but inside the small house, a new resolve had taken root. They were no longer just surviving. They were going to fight back. The blizzard passed, leaving the prairie buried under a thick blanket of white, a world pristine and silent. But the peace was deceptive. Cain's next move was his most devastating yet. Under the cover of the deep snows, his men worked upriver, building a crude but effective dam across the creek that was the lifeblood of Jed's ranch. The effect was not immediate, but as the winter snows began, their slow spring melt, the creek dwindled to a trickle. By late April, the watering holes were drying up, the new grass was withering, and the cattle grew thin and restless. It was a slow, deliberate strangulation. He's going to starve us out, Gus said, his weathered face grim as he looked at the parched earth. We can't last the summer without that water. Desperation settled over the ranch like the endless dust. They had to act. Their target was no longer Cain himself, but the truth he had worked so hard to bury. The Dr. Amelia said one evening, poring over an old map of Dodge City. Dr. Albright. If he left town suddenly, he might have left his records behind. Medical ledger's notes. Something that could prove Sarah's death was a medical complication, not murder. That was 6 years ago, Jed countered, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. Those records could be anywhere, or destroyed. But they might not be, she insisted. His old office was on Front Street. It's a tailor shop now, but maybe the old records were stored somewhere. In the town archives, a back room. People don't always throw things away. It was a desperate gamble, a sliver of hope in a sea of despair. They decided that Amelia, less known in town and less likely to arouse suspicion, would go to Dodge to search for the records. Jed and Gus would make a diversion, a bold and dangerous attempt to dynamite a small section of Cain's dam, hoping to draw his men away from the town and buy Amelia the time she needed. The night before she was to leave, Jed found her on the small porch staring out at the moonlit prairie. He came to stand beside her, his presence a solid, reassuring weight in the darkness. It's too dangerous, he said quietly. If Cain finds out what you're doing, it is no more dangerous than sitting here waiting for our land to turn to desert. she replied, turning to face him. "We are a team now, Jedediah. We fight this together, or we lose everything separately." He looked down at her, his gray eyes filled with a mixture of fear and admiration. In the months since the blizzard, their alliance had deepened into something more. The shared danger, the late-night conversations, the small unconscious gestures of care. A cup of coffee left for him by the fire. His jacket draped over her shoulders, and when the evening grew cold, had woven a bond between them stronger than any vow. He reached out his calloused hand, cupping her cheek. His touch was no longer hesitant, but gentle and sure. "I was a fool, Amelia. To think I could protect you by keeping you at a distance. All I did was leave you alone." "I was never truly alone," she whispered, leaning into his touch. "I was just waiting for you to see me." He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of desperation or grief, but one of promise, a quiet acknowledgement of the love that had grown in the harshest of soils. "Come back to me," he murmured against her hair. "Always," she promised. The next morning, as the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky, Amelia rode for Dodge City, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and hope. Miles away, Jed and Gus packed dynamite into saddlebags, preparing to ride toward the creek and toward a confrontation they might not survive. The future of the ranch and their lives now rested on a 6-year-old medical ledger that might not even exist. The saloon in Dodge City was a cauldron of noise and smoke. The tinny notes of a piano fought a losing battle against the roar of laughter, drunken arguments, and the clatter of poker chips. Jedediah Stone stood just inside the swinging doors, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. The air was thick with the smell of cheap whiskey sweat and desperation. At a back table, surrounded by his men, sat Silas Kane. He looked up as Jed entered, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his handsome face. He made a grand, sweeping gesture with his hand, inviting Jed forward. The noise in the saloon faltered, then died completely as patrons shrank away, sensing the lethal tension that had just entered the room. The piano player's hands froze above the keys. Jed walked slowly toward the table, his spurs ringing a lonely rhythm on the spittoon-stained floorboards. He stopped 10 feet away, his body loose, his hand hovering near the butt of his Colt. "Jedediah Stone." Kane said, his voice carrying through the sudden silence. "To what do I owe the honor? Have you finally come to your senses, ready to sign over that pathetic little patch of dirt?" "The dam comes down, Kane." Jed said, his voice low and even. "Tonight." Kane laughed, a rich, theatrical sound. "An ultimatum. From a man who has already lost, you are more entertaining than I gave you credit for. You see, this was never just about the land. The land is simply the stage for our little drama. This is about justice. For Sarah." "You know nothing about justice," Jed growled. "I know that you took her from me." Kane's voice cracked like a whip, the cultured veneer falling away to reveal the raw fury beneath. He rose to his feet, his hand resting on the silver-handled pistol at his hip. "She was mine to protect, and you, a coarse, dirt-grubbing homesteader, you filled her head with pathetic dreams of love and family. You used her, you broke her, and you threw her away like so much trash when she was no longer of use to you." "That's a lie," Jed said, his voice tight. "Is it?" Kane sneered. "I am her brother Pittman. I am Silas, her blood. Who do you think the world will believe?" The revelation hit the silent onlookers like a physical shock. This was not a dispute over land. It was a blood feud. "She loved me." Jed said the simple words, a shield against Kane's poison. "Her love made her weak," Kane roared. "And your lust killed her. And for that I will strip away everything you have, just as you stripped away my sister's life. I will take your land, your name, and when you are a broken, forgotten man, I will take your life." The world narrowed to the space between them. The smoky air, the silent faces, the smell of fear, it all faded away. There was only the righteous fury in one man's eyes, and the grim resolve in the other's. Cain's hand moved. It wasn't a quick draw. It was a deliberate, calculated motion. Jed reacted in the same instant, his own Colt seeming to leap into his hand. The saloon exploded in a deafening roar. Glass shattered behind the bar. A bullet tore a splintered furrow in the table beside Cain. Jed felt a searing pain in his side as a piece of shrapnel from a ricochet sliced through his shirt. They fired again, the explosions overlapping. Cain's men started to rise, but a look from their leader froze them in place. This was his duel. His alone. Jed dived behind an overturned card table as bullets chewed the wood above his head. He was outmatched. Cain was faster, and his rage made him reckless and unpredictable. Jed was fighting for his life, but Cain was fighting for something he believed was holy. He risked a glance over the table. Cain was reloading his movements, swift and sure. In that moment, Jed knew he was going to die. He had led a ghost to his door, and now the ghost had come to claim him. Then the saloon doors swung open. Amelia stood there, framed against the evening light. She wasn't carrying a weapon. In her hands, she held a large, worn, leather-bound book. Her face was pale, but determined, her eyes locked on Cain. The corrupt town sheriff Brody was right behind her, his face a mask of confusion and anger. Silas Cain, her voice rang out clear and strong, cutting through the tense silence. Cain spun around, his eyes wide with surprise. What is this? This is the truth, Amelia said, taking a step into the room. She held up the book. I have Dr. Albright's medical ledger from 1878. A flicker of panic crossed Cain's face, so quick Jed almost missed it. Lies, a forgery. Is it? Amelia's gaze was unwavering. She opened the book to a marked page. Let me read what the doctor wrote on the night your sister died. She began to read, her voice steady and clear, each word a hammer blow against the foundation of Cain's hatred. Patient Sarah Pittman. Prolonged labor 2 days. Cephalopelvic disproportion. She looked directly at Cain. That means the baby was too large to pass through the birth canal. It's a known medical complication. A tragic, blameless event. She continued, reading, her voice rising with each damning clinical detail. Hemorrhage from tearing. Husband attentive and supportive throughout. No fault of either party. She closed the book with a sharp snap. Your sister didn't die because of Jed's lust or cruelty. She died because of a medical tragedy that no one could have prevented. The doctor did his best, and her husband was by her side. There is no villain in this story, Silas. Only grief. The silence in the saloon was absolute. Cain stared at her, his face ashen. The righteous fury that had fueled him for 6 years, the story he had told himself, the narrative that gave his life purpose. It was all gone, shattered by a few lines of faded ink in a doctor's ledger. All that was left was the empty, ugly face of his own obsessive rage. No, he whispered. He ran the doctor off. He ran him off to hide the truth, didn't he? Amelia pressed. So you could have your villain. So you could nurse your hatred. Jed rose slowly from behind the table, his gun still in his hand. He looked at Cain, and for the first time, he didn't see a monster. He saw a broken man, a boy who had loved his sister so much he had destroyed himself in her name. Cain's face contorted, the grief and rage twisting into a mask of pure, nihilistic hate. If his cause was a lie, then all that was left was destruction. He raised his pistol, not at Jed, but at Amelia. Jed fired, not at Cain's heart, but at his arm. The shot was precise, a surgeon's cut. Kane cried out, his pistol clattering to the floor. He staggered back, clutching his bleeding arm, his eyes wide with shock and the final bitter taste of defeat. Jed walked forward and kicked the gun away. He stood over his defeated enemy, the smoking Colt in his hand. He could end it. He could pull the trigger and silence the ghost forever. But as he looked into Kane's empty eyes, he felt no hatred, only a vast, weary pity. Killing him now would be an execution, not a victory. He lowered his gun. The fight was over. The truth had won. In the aftermath, the town of Dodge City seemed to exhale a breath it had been holding for years. With Kane's righteous crusade exposed as a lie built on grief and intimidation, Sheriff Brody's corrupt authority crumbled. The townsfolk who had turned a blind eye to the escalating conflict now rallied behind Jed. They had witnessed a man's honor being publicly restored, and it stirred something decent within them. The next morning, a small army of ranchers and townsmen rode out with Jed to the dam. There were no grand speeches, just the quiet determination of neighbors helping a neighbor. With ropes, pickaxes, and a final carefully placed charge of dynamite, they breached the structure. The water of the creek, held captive for months, surged free, a brown churning torrent that rushed downstream to breathe life back into Jed's parched land. Watching the water flow, Jed felt a cleansing of his own, a washing away of the isolation and bitterness that had held him captive for so long. A week later, he visited Silas Kane in the town jail. Kane sat on his cot, his arm in a sling, his face a hollow mask. He looked up as Jed entered, his burning blue eyes now dull and lifeless. "Have you come to gloat?" Kane asked, his voice a dry rasp. "No," Jed said, standing on the other side of the bars. "I came to say I'm sorry." Kane's hollow laugh echoed in the small cell. "Sorry for what?" "For winning." "I'm sorry for your loss," Jed said quietly. "I loved her too. I grieved for her every day for 6 years. Your grief turned to poison, Silas. Mine just turned to stone. Neither one of us honored her memory by living that way." Kane said nothing, turning his face to the wall. There was no forgiveness in the air, no easy reconciliation. There was only the shared tragic acknowledgement of a wound that would never fully heal, and the quiet understanding that their war was finally truly over. They began to rebuild. The community helped Jed and Amelia repair the fire-damaged barn and restock the cattle that had been rustled. Gus, who had taken a bullet in the leg during the diversion at the dam, supervised from a rocking chair on the porch, dispensing advice with his usual gruff humor. The ranch, once a place of silence and fear, was now filled with the sounds of hammer saws and the easy laughter of friends. Life settled into a new rhythm, one of peace and quiet purpose. The spring turned to a lush green summer. The cattle grew fat on the rich grass, and the garden Amelia had so carefully tended produced a bounty of vegetables. They worked side by side, their partnership seamless and unspoken. The memory of the violence faded, replaced by the simple, profound joy of building a life together. Months later, as the first chill of autumn sharpened the air, the new U.S. Marshal, a stern but fair man who had replaced Brody, delivered a small parcel to the ranch. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was the silver locket. That evening, Jed stood before the fireplace. He held the locket in his palm, its weight familiar and heavy. For years it had been a symbol of unbearable loss, a relic he could only touch in the sterile confines of a bank vault. Now it was just a memory, part of a story that had finally found its end. He opened it. He looked at the faces of the young man and woman smiling out from the past. He felt a pang of sadness, but it was a clean, honest grief, no longer tangled with guilt or fear. He closed the locket and placed it on the mantelpiece, not hidden away in a box, but in the heart of their home. A quiet acknowledgement that the past was a part of him, but it no longer defined him. Amelia came to stand beside him, her hand finding his. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. "I am," he said. And he was surprised to find it was the complete truth. He turned to her, his heart full of a love so deep it almost hurt. "Sarah is at peace, and so am I." Amelia smiled, her eyes shining in the firelight. Her hand moved from his and came to rest on her still flat stomach. "That's good," she said, her voice filled with a gentle, radiant joy, "because our family's about to get a little bigger." Jed stared at her, his mind struggling to comprehend her words. He looked from her smiling face to the hand resting on her abdomen, and understanding dawned. "I'm with child Jedediah," she whispered. A wave of emotion washed over him so powerful it took his breath away. He felt a surge of pure primal terror, the ghost of his old fear rising for a final desperate battle. But then he looked into Amelia's eyes, saw the love and trust shining there, and a different feeling, a tidal wave of fierce protective joy, crashed over him, extinguishing the last embers of his fear. His reaction was not one of crippling dread, but of tempered, wondrous joy. He sank to his knees before her, his hands coming to rest gently over hers, over the place where their child, a new beginning, was growing. Tears streamed down his face, not of grief, but of a gratitude so profound it felt holy. He had been given a second chance at life, at love, at fatherhood. He had learned that true strength wasn't in avoiding risk, but in facing it with an open heart. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light across the prairie. From the porch, they could see the land they had fought for, the cattle grazing peacefully, the creek flowing steady and strong. Jed rose and pulled his wife into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. They stood together on the porch of the home they had built, looking out at the endless horizon, a true partnership forged in the crucible of loss and redeemed by the enduring power of love. Their future stretched before them as vast and full of promise as the Kansas sky.